Today's launch is embedded in the Georgetown Law Global Trade Academy, an executive education program with nearly 20 years of experience in training governments, lawyers, and scholars, not just on the letter of the law, but also on how the legal foundations of the global trading system interact with today's policy landscape. This legacy program was launched by the late John H. Jackson, a Georgetown law professor and an architect of the global trading system, and a founder of the Institute of International Economic Law. In this slide, I'm excited for the new center led by Professors Jennifer Hillman and Katrin Coleman to build on this legacy by navigating the major shifts currently occurring in the field of international trade law. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Pamela Cook-Hamilton, a Georgetown alumna who has returned to Georgetown for this occasion. Pamela Cook-Hamilton is the Executive Director of the International Trade Center, the joint agency of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and the World Trade Organization for Trade and International Business Development. Previously, she was Director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities at UNCTAD, as well as Executive Director at the Caribbean Export Development Agency. She has worked extensively with the private sector across the African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, as well as with universities and academia to build trade-related institutional strength within member states. As a strong proponent of gender equality and mainstreaming in trade, she established the Women Empowered Through Export, We Export, platform to address the disadvantages women-owned firms experience in accessing markets. These are just a few highlights from Pamela's impressive bio, so needless to say, I am excited to hand the mic to Pamela to give us her insights on inclusive trade. With that, Pamela.
Thank you so much. So good to be here. I remember this view. I don't remember the room being this nice, but I remember the view. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here this evening. I want to thank Jennifer and Katrin. When I just came here, when I was posted here in 1993, some of you weren't born yet, right? And I never expected to be back here 25 years after graduation, addressing my alma mater. So Google tells me my alma mater means nourishing mother, and Georgetown certainly did nourish me at a very critical time in my life and in my career. I met a lot of great friends here. I see Barbara in the audience. I just gave Irving a big hug because I haven't seen him in years, but these are all people who helped form who I became and what I believe and my approach to life. As a young Jamaican Foreign Service officer when I came, and I was fresh off a posting in Geneva during the Uruguay round. Not sure that that's something that I should say yeah about, but Barbara is laughing. But, you know, I was just beginning to understand how to assume my space as a woman in the very male arena of trade policy. Now, when you go to Geneva now, you see women. When I was there were like maybe 6 of us in that entire, you know, you remember, Jennifer, there weren't many of us. You could count, you know, okay. So it was really a very important time for me. As a representative also of a small island developing state in a club of big, rich countries that set the trade agenda, it also took a lot for us to be present and to have our voice heard. So today's theme of inclusive trade is very personal to me, and the mission of the center that Jennifer and Katrin are launching couldn't be any closer to my heart. I've been asked to give a 10 to 15 minute opening talk on inclusive trade whilst, you know, kind of sparing you the blizzard of statistics or bury you in UN jargon, because we can do that. I could spend 15 minutes giving you all the acronyms and so on. But let me start by telling you a story. Like most heads of UN agencies, you know, you get invited to all kinds of panels and diplomatic speak and, you know, all the stuff. And I decided last week, 2 weeks ago, to ditch that. And I went off to Central America. And it was one of the most incredible periods of my life, experiences of my life. First, we went to Guatemala City, then in a car for 3 hours, past live volcanoes and miles of wonderful countryside, to a place called Ciudad Pedro de Alvarado, right on the border with El Salvador. And the International Trade Center has a USAID-funded project there. And there's a community of small businesses that has grown up around the border post at the edge of the city. When the government, in the name of course, promoting trade facilitation, which we all promote very actively and say is a good thing, decided that in light of that, they needed to move the border post, needless to say, the community pushed back and pushed back hard. So their livelihoods were built around the miles-long line of trucks waiting at the border. They serviced these trucks. They worked on food provision, on all kinds of other. And so their livelihoods were now at risk. And naturally, you're going to resist if your livelihood is put at risk, particularly given COVID. So in partnership with the municipal authorities, we helped to retrain these small businesses owners and do new things. It was a classic case of trade adjustment assistance, but in a remote, resource-constrained community. I spent a morning in a restaurant by the roadside listening to their stories. It was hot, unlike here, and horns blared loudly in the background, but the testimonies I heard really changed my life, and I won't forget them for a very long time because it really underscored for me why we believe and why I do what I do. So I'm telling you this story because it encapsulates what I think inclusive trade is all about. At its core, it's about ensuring that trade works for everyone, that everyone has a seat at the table, that everyone has a voice, and that that voice is heard, especially developing countries, vulnerable communities, minorities, women, and small businesses. But in a wider sense, it's also about a certain kind of recognition. First, it's a recognition that just because trade laws and regulations are neutral on the page, and we trade lawyers, I see John here. I didn't recognize you with your mask on, but we trade lawyers build entire careers policing that neutrality. Their outcomes all too often are not neutral. That lack of neutrality matters. Discussion we're having today is just the sound of words on a page meeting economic reality. The second thing is it's a recognition that creating inclusive trade is hard. I really want to emphasize this point. During the last few months, I've been pushing my own staff to really stretch out their offer on the core elements of inclusive trade, on the green economy, on gender, youth, and the digital connectivity, and the fundamentals of inclusivity in the 21st century. I deliberately labeled that internal exercise as a moonshot. It brings to mind the moment that JFK said that America had chosen to go to the moon in a decade, not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Inclusive trade is not something fuzzy or nice to have. Well-designed and properly funded, it can be as crunchy, impactful, and results-driven as anything else we do in trade policy. I believe that inclusivity is the trade moonshot of our time. My parents' generation created the basic structures of trade. My peers and I fleshed out those ideas into the multilateral system we use today. The challenge of the next generation of trade professionals, you, is to spread the benefits as widely and as evenly as possible. Third, it's a recognition that inclusivity really matters in the crazy world in which we're living, and crazy it is. It's all too easy in diplomatic and very political towns like Geneva or Washington to focus on the handful of big players, to think that their struggles alone define the long-term stability and legitimacy of the global trade. That view doesn't make a lot of sense to me, and let me tell you why. When 90% of the world's businesses and more than half of global employment in micro, small, and medium-sized firms is 90% of the world's businesses, when right now Africa's population under 35 is almost 1 billion people, and that number will grow by nearly 200% by the end of this century. When advancing gender equality could add an estimated $12 trillion to the global GDP, but women entrepreneurs run less than 1/3 of the world's small businesses. Every great endeavor, every great moonshot begins with a moment of recognition. And I feel we're at one of those moments with inclusive trade. And those 3 moments of recognition build up to probably the most important recognition of all, that we need to revisit the foundations of the trading system we've built up. A lot of countries are taking a long, hard look at the trade agreements that they've signed, even the ones they enthusiastically pushed, and ask themselves the classic Latin phrase, cui bono, who benefits? For those of you that might still be skeptical that inclusivity can be transformational, let me give you a few examples of what I think inclusive moonshots can look like. Let me throw out 5 challenges to you. I'll start with the area of trade that's about as far from sexy as possible. Public procurement. Sexy, isn't it? It really gets your juices going. The trade policy details of procurement aren't exactly ready for net, but the numbers are staggering. It's an $11 trillion US market. And the lower down the economic ladder you go, the higher the share of the economy. Public procurement accounts for up to 40% of GDP in some least developed countries. But only 1% of this public procurement pie goes to women-owned businesses. 1%. So challenge number 1, can you imagine if we could change that, even by a few percentage points, to carve out 5, 10% of that global pie for women? Just think of what that small shift do. Let me give you another example I feel particularly strongly about, and I've been on this for a while. Cobalt in the Congo. Here we have a situation where nearly 2/3 of the raw material lying at the heart of every national net zero strategy is mined in one country. 70 to 80% of the cobalt that is funding, actually allowing electric vehicles to be made, on which everybody is basing their net zero, comes from one country. And we look at the labor, it's appalling. The child labor, the exploitation, the conditions under which they work. I recognize that there are important steps being taken. My own organization is helping the EU and other countries ensure that measures like supply chain due diligence mean that markets suddenly don't slam shut for women or for country exporters. That developing countries aren't left to pay the cost for what is ultimately a good thing. But the situation continues while climate ambitions keep ramping up. So challenge number 2, can we reach net zero on the back of a global supply chain in cobalt that we can truly, honestly call sustainable and inclusive? Is it something that we can live with? Because at the end of the day, we will have another blood diamond coming, and I'm not sure how many of us want to be part of that. Another area is helping small businesses, especially in developing countries, make the green transition. We know that 100 or so large firms account for nearly 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. But how will millions upon millions of small businesses around the world make the green transition? The ones who aren't represented in forums like COP. I was there last November. There was not one MSME present in that, I think it was 4-block hall. They don't have public affairs reps and they don't have easy access to credit. The small firms that see sustainability as only bringing new costs and risks, not new opportunities. So challenge number 3, can we make going green the default business and trade reality? How do we work with them? And the digital revolution. 4th, late last year I was in Ghana and Nigeria, meeting with the beneficiaries of our flagship Women's Economic Empowerment Program, She Trade. I was amazed to hear many of these women entrepreneurs, thanks to the training that we offered in branding, digital marketing, and e-commerce sales, were actually able to not just survive during the pandemic, but actually increase their sales simply by making that one pivot using digital connectivity and e-commerce. It makes a difference and it matters. And as we move forward in the 21st century, it's going to be more critical. The challenge number 4, how can we ensure that all businesses and traders can make that digital leap that we all made during the pandemic, not just the ones who can afford unlimited data and reliable broadband? And one last area, consultation and dialogue. In the nearly 60 years that the ITC has been in business, we've gotten a lot of requests from governments to help them engage in a wider constituency in trade policymaking. It's a recognition that if you're aiming for an inclusive outcome, you have to start with an inclusive thought. As my mom used to say, God bless her, you can't start wrong a morning and come good at evening. It's Jamaican, sorry. But essentially, you can't start bad and end up, just doesn't work. So the stakes are enormous. The African Continental Free Trade Area is one example. Currently, intra-African trade is less than 1/5 of Africa's total trade. Under the AFCFTA, this is meant to increase to 1/2. All this in a total African market of $2.5 trillion US. So the fifth and final challenge is how can we ensure that processes like the AFCFTA reflect the interests and aspirations of small businesses, women entrepreneurs, and young people in Africa. So there you have it. 3 moments of recognition, 5 challenges, 1 moonshot. Those of you completing the Global Trade Academy will be going out into the world as shapers of policy, as foot soldiers in the battle to make trade more inclusive. I'm in the departure lounge, and I think a couple others of us are, like Irving and others. But those of you who are coming in, sorry, Irving, I didn't mean to call you out, but I'm looking for company here. So in the spirit of this new center, let me pose the biggest challenge of all. Ask yourself the hard question. Is what I'm doing helping more people to benefit from trade? Am I looking beyond the statistics of trade facilitation and customs formalities and reaching out to communities like Ciudad Pedro de Alvarado? Am I cutting through the diplomatic blah, 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 and really tackling the big, daunting, complex inequalities at the heart of global trade? Am I putting research, political capital, and money into the issues facing the bottom of the pyramid? If your answer is yes, then you're not just putting icing on the cake. You are shoring the future of the system from the ground up. You're making the moonshot, not because it's easy, but precisely because it's hard. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for this fantastic and inspirational speech and also stage setter for the ensuing discussion. I don't think you could have put a better framework for what is to come. With that, let me briefly introduce our additional speakers who just joined us, the 2 newly minted CITD co-directors, Professors Jennifer Hillman and Katrin Coleman. Before we dive into the discussion, I do want to say a few words about them. Jennifer Hillman, she is professor of practice here at Georgetown Law, and she is teaching the lead courses on international business and trade. She's also a senior fellow with the Center on Foreign Relations, co-chair of the Center for Climate and Trade, and a former member of the WTO's appellate body. Katrin Coleman is visiting professor of law here at Georgetown Law and the president and founder of New Markets Lab. She is also a senior associate with the Global Food Security Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In addition to teaching top trade law courses, she teaches law and development, which focuses on interdisciplinary and inclusive links between different areas of international law. With that, I am happy to launch into our discussion. Maybe the first pretty apparent question to me, or obvious question, is, why now? Maybe I'll hand it over to Jennifer to answer this question.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, first, welcome to everyone. It is such a treat to look around this room and see so many of our colleagues from Georgetown Law School, so many students, and so many others in the trade space here. I want to start by saying a huge thank you to Marie for the amazing job that she has done throughout this whole week putting on the Global Trade Academy, for all of her help in helping launch this center, and for putting this event together. So thank you. And secondly, I want to thank particularly my partner in this, Katrin Coleman, for her really brilliant idea of bringing together her approach to looking at trade from a very bottom-up perspective with my thoughts on how we could look at reforming the WTO and other institutions from the top down and find a way to meet in the middle. And if there are any two people that could maybe meet, my hope is that it would be Katrin Coleman and I. And last, I really want to say a huge thank you to Pamela Koch-Hamilton. Pamela and I have known each other since more years ago than I would want to count. When we were traipsing the world, negotiating agreements on textiles and clothing, Pamela for Jamaica and I for the United States. And our paths have fortunately crossed here and there over those many years. So a huge thank you. But let me get to your question of sort of the why now. And I think everything that Pamela said really says it better than I could, but there's no question in my mind. We're looking at a paradigm shift, an absolutely tectonic shift in what is going on in the trade space. And so for me, the whole idea behind this center is to seize on that and to recognize that we, the system, and everybody involved in it has got to change. I mean, back again in our day, we thought of trade and labor, trade and the environment, trade and development, trade and gender, trade and climate change. And I think at its heart, the goal of this center is to erase the word and to say that trade has got to have at its core all of those things. And that to me is really the sort of why and why now, because I don't think the trading system status quo can keep going. It has got to learn, it has got to pivot, it has got to change so that it embraces, again, the and message as part of its core. Yeah.
Jennifer, maybe I'll hand it over to Katrin to elaborate a little bit on why this.
Thank you so much, Marie. And I just want to echo Jennifer's thanks to you for everything that you do for this week, but everything that you've done working with us to make this happen over the last months and years even, and to Jennifer as well. Like you said, I cannot think of a better partner in this. And I really feel like together and with all of you, honestly, that we can make this happen. So this has to be a collective effort. And Pamela, I think you and I have also known each other my entire career, which is now a fairly long amount of time. But I remember very early on working at a law firm and trying to figure out how I could bring gender and trade into our kind of practice at the law firm and trying every creative way I could think of, and then meeting you and thinking, okay, I can do this. I can do this. So I just want to add to what Jennifer said about the why now. And I think in addition to being at this real turning point, we also have this tremendous opportunity right now. The way that we talk about trade is shifting. If you look around, look at President Biden's statements on trade, look at what other governments are saying on trade, the words development, inclusive. I wish other things like equitable would appear more often, but they will. And sustainable are starting to come up more and more and more in the trade dialogue. But as Pamela has said, we have a really tough job ahead of us. We have all of these words, but we don't yet have a concrete plan for action. And that's what I think this center, I hope, can contribute, is pulling us all together so that we can find a way to move forward and get things done. And I think along with this opportunity and this big question of how, I totally agree with you, by the way, that I think doing this is hard. I think I always tell my students, doing development is hard. You have to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard to actually make things happen if you want to change. And if you don't want to just go with the status quo. And I think that part of the reason that we need this is that we have to change the status quo. I think you touched on this in your remarks. I think part of the reason the system is broken and stuck is because it doesn't take into account diversity, inclusivity, and historical bias. And we haven't really figured out yet how to deal with the fact that the rules create advantages for some, but not all, and that many have not been able to exercise an equal voice in shaping the system. And we have to figure that out if we're going to go forward. I think we also right now too have these global challenges that we're all facing together. I think the pandemic really highlighted that. Climate change also, and war, and rising food insecurity, and these challenges of inclusion and distribution. And these require completely different solutions than when we were putting the system together to begin with. And so I think that that has to be part of it too. And then I just will say one last thing, which is that I think what's exciting to me too is that law is central to all of this. And it is a tool that we can really use to move things forward. But development is interdisciplinary. We can't look at just trade. We have to think about other aspects of international law, human rights, agriculture and food, health, finance, investment. And fortunately at Georgetown, I think that we have so many tools and strengths that we can bring to bear. So I will stop with that. Thanks, Marie.
Thank you, Katrin. And you already alluded to that a little bit, but we had why now, why this, and maybe Jennifer, will let you elaborate a little bit more on the why Georgetown.
Well, fantastic. I do think that building this center here at Georgetown Law, to me, allows us to do three really important things. One is to build on the legacy of John Jackson, who taught at this law school and used it as his base to develop his ideas and plans for what would become the WTO's dispute settlement system and a real commitment to the rules-based trading system. Indeed, I often judge and speak at the moot court competition involving WTO law. And I'm occasionally asked sort of, how is it that the United States refuses to join the International Court of Justice or the International Criminal Court or the Inter-American Court on Human Rights or fill in the blank, any other international court? The United States says no. And yet we agreed to join the WTO with its binding dispute settlement system. And my answer is always John Jackson. He simply provided the persuasion and the intellectual underpinning and the development that allowed the United States to move in a direction that we've not seen. So that's part of it. I would say, secondly, it's the opportunity to leverage so much that Georgetown has to offer. I'm looking out here into this room and saying, we've got smart, energetic, engaged, brilliant students to pull into this effort. And it is a lot of their ideas that are going to move it forward. We've got the ability to marry sort of clinical and practical experiences for students to figure out, how does trade actually work down there at the grassroots level? How do we make trade work for real people? We've also got the ability to draw on an incredible number of centers and institutes here at Georgetown. I'm looking at my colleagues from the Harrison Institute for Policy Law. We have got the Georgetown Climate Center. We have got the O'Neill Institute for Global Health, and on and on. So there is just a tremendous amount of sort of interdisciplinary resources within Georgetown. And the third thing to me that's really critical is we've got the opportunity to educate the next generation of trade lawyers who I hope will see and study trade law from a bigger, deeper, and wider perspective than we've ever taught it before, and that it's ever been sort of understood coming out. And that those that then come out of Georgetown can leave and go into that trade law space with a lot of the larger issues that are at the heart of this center, having been part of their core learning experience here at Georgetown.
I think, Katrin, you mentioned at the beginning a little bit about the marrying of the bottom-up and top-down approach that both you and Jennifer basically signify. Can you elaborate a little bit on how the center will capitalize on that?
I think this is so central to how we see this work. And when Jennifer and I started talking about this, we realized that just thinking about reform of the system itself was not going to be enough. We had to really try to figure out, and I think Pamela spoke about this so much in her speech, we had to really try to understand how to make the rules work for those they are meant to serve. How could we really understand better the experiences that individuals are having? And trade law doesn't always help us with that. I think that we tend to approach it from this perspective of the role of states and international agreements. I was a trade negotiator at the beginning of my career too. And our great achievement sometimes would be getting an agreement signed. But that's just the beginning. And what goes into that agreement really matters too. And so this is something I've been thinking about literally my entire career. I started as a trade negotiator working the top down, and I believe very strongly in that. I really believe that there's so much that you can do there. But I kept getting frustrated because I wanted to understand better. We talked about trade and development. It was in all of our talking points. It was something that, not like now, it's not being used, it was not used as quite as much, but still we talked about it, about trade having this powerful role in development. But when I would really try to scratch the surface on how that worked, I found that I just had many more questions than I had answers. And so when I decided to leave government service, I went to an NGO, which was sort of unheard of. And I decided that I wanted to really understand field work. I wanted to understand what was really happening rather than just thinking that maybe I did. So I spent a huge part of my career doing what Pamela talked about, going to the cities and villages where trade was not a word that was used very often, if at all. I went to Morocco to talk to women about their experiences with a recent FTA, realized that I couldn't use the word trade. I couldn't say FTA. I couldn't talk about anything having anything to do with what I had done before, except to just listen and try to understand day to day what they were experiencing. And then wound up creating a nonprofit, the New Markets Lab, which I'm still running, that enabled me to work in about 20 or more African countries, really travel an entire corridor in Tanzania, do things that, I would read about and see what was really happening in practice. And like Pamela said too, I learned how to talk about trade differently, approach it differently, think about it differently, really try to question the context and the assumptions that I had made before. So I would say there are four things that kind of go, because one of Marie's questions, I think, was how do you bring the top down and the bottom up together? And it's not easy. It's really not easy to do. But I think four things, maybe there are five. I'll say there are five. One is I think you have to listen. You have to listen. You cannot assume that you have the answers. You have to listen to what others are experiencing. And then you have to learn. And we all have to learn. Every single one of us, whether we're teaching, have been doing this for 40 years, or whether we're just starting out, there is so much to learn. We will never know everything there is to possibly know. But I love that aspect of this, that development really pushes you to learn. And that's another reason I think this belongs at Georgetown. We have to question. We have to question everything. Why do we think that? Why do we think that's the best practice? Is that really the best practice everywhere? Is it contextual? And often everything is. And I think once you get out of this frame of thinking there's one way of doing things, it really opens you up, I think, to have this top down, bottom up approach and build awareness. Again, that's part of learning, I think, but that is an important part of this too. And I think it's linked with capacity building, but I think it's not, again, telling anyone that we have the answers. It's really trying to just build a greater understanding of what the possibilities are. And then I think we have to innovate. And I see so much innovation starting to happen right now in international law, which is one of the reasons I think this is so exciting that we're looking at this now. But this is, again, partly too where I'm so inspired by my students. They have ideas on how to do this that are so different than what many of us do. And I think that we can really kind of push ourselves out of what we have, sort of assumed to be the contours of international trade law and try to do some really transformational things.
Thank you, Katrin. And I want to bring in Pamela. Obviously, the ITC is clearly doing a lot of important work on this, also on the ground. I wonder, where has it been difficult to make progress, and what other players are in the field? And maybe most importantly, how do you think the center can add to the debate or to the work?
Thanks so much, Marie. First of all, let me just say that I think Georgetown is a natural place because I came here. No, but when I'll tell you one short story. When I got here in '93, I applied to one law school, and it was Georgetown, because of the reputation that Georgetown has always had as a law school that understands intrinsically the connection between policy and actual doing, between trade and development. And I came here and I got that. And that for me has basically been the grounding of my career in trade and development. So that's my answer for you. Now, on the issue of why is it hard? I've had meetings all of this week with several members of the US government, and just met with the SBA and on the Hill and so on. And it's hard because at the end of the day, we keep tinkering around the system. we won't go to the center. And it's what Jennifer talked about, the trade and. We keep cutting off the and. And if you keep cutting off the and making it extra, then it never becomes a central part of the actual discussion. How does this impact the people? And one of the discussions I had earlier with Catherine Tai was simply talking about, for example, AGOA. Why haven't these trade agreements really worked? It's nice. They're beautifully, beautifully crafted. We do good jobs. Trade lawyers, we're great. Commas, colons, we can do it. It makes a difference. But at the end of the day, why haven't they been utilized? Why haven't they worked? Because you need to have that missing middle that translates this trade agreement to the people on the ground. And who does that? The private sector, the people who actually do trade. And a lot of times, nobody speaks to them. There's been no real conversation. And so how do you begin to translate that? Nobody speaks to the women really either. Hardly ever at the table. Young people, maybe. TikTok, yeah. But at the end of the day, why I think this center is critical is two things that I think can happen. One has to do with the rethinking trade. Exactly what you're saying. We have to rethink it and we have to create the linkages. And I think one of the key areas that the center can do is build a coalition of the willing to actually speak about these issues on a stage. DC doesn't really speak about these. No, it's something other people do. NGOs, other people. But bring together the State Department, USTR, academia, policymakers, all the people who can really think through how trade can actually be worker-centric or people-centered. The how is important. We can say it, but how do you drill down and make it happen? The second thing I think that the center can do is looking at inclusivity from a trade law perspective and translating it also up in the sense that it's in all our speeches. Inclusivity, equitable, gender, framing, nice words. What does it mean? The center can do that translation as well so that when we go back to the WTO and we've gotten this great informal working group on gender, and we now have an informal working group on MSMEs, but nobody has a clue how to embed it in a WTO context. So it always is in the and category. That's also important. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. And I'll get to that part of the collaboration in a little bit as well. I would love to, borrow from your inspiring speech, Pamela, and kind of apply the language of the moonshot. If the center and its mission are your moonshot, what are your most urgent challenges to address? I think we have talked about a lot of the recognition of things, as Pamela put it, but what are the urgent challenges to address first? Jennifer, I'll head it over to you.
This is obviously very difficult. So I guess for me, I think there's two things. So maybe I'm off to the moon and then on to Mars or somewhere. So let me say, I guess for the moonshot for me, I think it would likely be in the area of trade and climate change, where I believe there is an absolutely urgent need to move beyond seeing trade and trade rules as a barrier to taking action against climate change. I mean, for the last 20 years, all we've heard is, oh, you can't do a border adjustment because it'll violate the WTO. You can't do this because. And to me, if we are going to address climate change and do it at the required scale and speed that we need, we have to marry climate change and trade. We have to ensure that green technologies move at scale, at speed right now. We have to ensure that policymakers understand that they can take very strong action against climate change without making their companies unreasonably uncompetitive. We have to use trade policy to reward those that are engaging in serious decarbonization. We have to use trade policy to encourage greater, again, incentives for deeper emissions reductions. We have got to pressure high emitting firms to catch up with all of the inefficient, the more efficient global competitors. So to me, this is the moonshot, is to try to figure out how do we harness private sector capital, private sector technology, with trade policies that will allow us to get serious and at scale on climate change. Then if I'm going on to Mars, to me, it is a lot of what Pamela just finished with is, all right, how do we bring ideas and approaches in to reform the WTO, while also, I think, working to understand the rise of regionalism and the role that regional agreements and regional alliances play within this system. I'm going to say this because I actually believe that the WTO is an institution worth saving. And I'm not sure that there's a lot of everyone around the world that would necessarily say that. I think there's an awful lot of a sense that, we can just let it slide into irrelevance, which is where we're headed. And I think that's wrong for a lot of the reasons that Pamela just said. I mean, if at the end of the day, we do figure out how to make trade no longer have the and, you are then going to need an institution to figure out how does it get actually implemented. I mean, how does it go beyond the comma and the colon to one that is actually going to be implemented? And to me, that really does mean thinking about the fact that right now, the perception at the WTO is that it is largely stuck in its 1945 mentality of worrying only about discrimination. That the raison d'etre of the WTO is MFN and national treatment. That's it, baby. And you can stop right there. And so the question is, how do you then pivot the institution to one in which its raison d'etre is inclusive trade? Its raison d'etre is making an affirmative contribution to solving climate change, is making an affirmative contribution to fighting COVID and the next global health crisis to come. Its raison d'etre is concerns about labor, about the fairness of economic distribution, about development. That has to become the core common set of principles of the WTO. And then you have to figure out a structure that can make that work in practice. So that's the sort of really out there, but at the same time, I think is going to be part of the core mission of what this center and at least for me, where a lot of this work is going to be done, is how do you then create an institution that can make these things happen in practice?
Do you have also challenges to add, Katrin?
I do, and I think Jennifer covered very well the areas that we really think need to be our sort of moonshot areas for the center. But I just would add a little bit to that. And I think it goes back to this idea of not having development as an add-on. I think it's also something that Pamela said. And one of the things that I've been saying in my classes lately is development is not neutral. None of this is neutral, right? We can't assume that there's sort of this veneer of neutrality over what we do. How do we really try to understand it more deeply? So for some of the work that I've been doing, and this I think applies in the context of regional trade, I think it applies in the context of gender, which is one of the priorities that we want to focus on. I've been waiting for that for 25 years. I'm so excited that we're now at this point where we're talking about this, and hopefully in the most inclusive way possible. And I think it applies also to development more. But if we think about how trade and development have traditionally been linked, it's through this concept of differentiation, special and differential treatment, right? This recognition that countries have different needs, perhaps depending on the level of development, but we don't differentiate very much within special and differential treatment. And one of the things that I think is so interesting to look at is, where is that starting to evolve? Does that mean looking at different kinds of vulnerability? Does it mean looking at whether countries are landlocked or small island nations? Does it mean looking at different communities and the challenges that they face? And I think some of the other concepts that we see, sustainability now, and linking to the Sustainable Development Goals, transparency, are incredibly important, and also places where we can stretch. But I'd like us to stretch even further. I think going to Jennifer's point about not just looking at this through a lens of non-discrimination or MFN and national treatment. One of the things that I feel like we need to keep talking about in the context of rules is flexibility, which is almost a bad word sometimes when you're talking about rules, because it means that you're talking about where the rules might have some leeway. But I think we've seen with the pandemic, we need that states need the ability to respond to things that change. Equity, I think, needs to be central to how we look at this. I think engagement, you talked about that so much, and I think that's so incredibly important. And then one thing that I also want to emphasize is we need to look more at how things are actually implemented, not just the agreement, what actually, what happens in practice. How do the rules actually work once they are being rolled out? And so I've started this whole mapping project along these 7 things. That's my moonshot, I guess, is trying to figure out how much I can map, how many different trade agreements I can look at, how much I can look at issues like gender. And I took these criteria and applied them to gender for a paper I've been working on for a WTO book project, and really forced myself to think, okay, what would women actually want if they were sitting at the negotiating table? Would they want a gender chapter? Would they want mention of the word gender? Or would they want a series of more tangible things? Would they want something that would help improve access to finance? Would they want something that would help change their work opportunities? Would they want something that would help make food more accessible for their families and their communities? And I think thinking about trade that way too, not just, again, putting in the words, putting in a chapter, but really thinking through what would have a meaningful impact, I feel like has to be part of how we think about this. It is not going to be easy. We know that, but I do really think it's possible.
Thank you, Katrin. I want to pick up on that last thing you said, that trade and gender has been put on the map multilaterally. So maybe, Pamela, for you, my question would be, how can we translate that political energy that we now have into transformational change, both multilaterally, but also really on the ground in the countries that we work in?
Thanks. Just wanted to pick up on what Katrin talked about in terms of the gender, because I think that's one really good example that we've been able to do at ITC. Both from the top-down and bottom-up approach, and how to make it transformational. One of the key elements of making things happen is that you can't just do it one way. You have to bring the elements together, or you'll either miss the policy side or you'll miss the practical side. What we were able to do, for example, in the gender space, is we started out at the policy level to actually be able to convince trade negotiators and countries that gender belonged in the discussion, because there was a deep resistance to including any discussion of gender. As a matter of fact, when I started the We Export program at Caribbean Export, the greatest opposition I had was from my own staff. Literally, and the men, sorry men, but their argument was that the Caribbean is already, has dominant woman. I wouldn't call us dominant. I'd just kind of call us, yeah, we're, I wouldn't call us dominant. We have equal share, or maybe a little more, but anyway. So why should we do special things for women? Why should we make a difference? And I said to them, let me give you one small example. If I were to try to take my son out of this country, I would need to get a letter from my husband. He doesn't need a letter from me. It's little laws like that. It's the little things, the access to finance, the fact that women's names aren't on certain titles, the little things that catch you. There, it appears neutral, but once you begin to dig deeper, the issues that affect women are very clear. So we managed to work through, and we got the 2017 Buenos Aires Declaration that was the top down. And everybody signed off. We had 127 countries signing, and it was great. But then what? Now we work from the bottom up. We began to embed these decisions and these actions at the ground level, working with governments, working with trade promotion organizations, working with women-owned businesses, putting in place the She Trades Outlook, where countries can now do their own self-assessment as to how their regulations, their rules actually work. And so you now have the bottom-up approach, and meeting in the middle is the perfect idea. But we think that you have to work at both levels, and this is what brings about the transformational change. The transformational change has to take place at both levels, the top down and the bottom up.
Well, on that note, you mentioned how you are working from the bottom up, but Jennifer, you have worked at the WTO for many years. You've done research on the WTO for many years, and you say it is worth saving. So maybe you could elaborate briefly on your idea of what is the role for the WTO in these future areas, or present areas, but the areas of the future, such as digital regulation, sustainability, gender equality, climate change. You can pick one of them.
Well, let me start with just sort of thinking about so why is the WTO worth saving? And, there is a part of me that says a lot of it is, I think, inherent in some of the unheralded actually work of the WTO. The reason the WTO is broken, I think, is pretty well known, but it's pretty clear the system is very out of balance. You have, in theory, the negotiating arm of the WTO, which I think everyone would agree is just simply not functioning. We've reached one agreement on trade facilitation in the 25 years that the WTO has been in existence. So that piece of the WTO, to be a negotiating forum for new rules, is not successful. You then have the judicial arm, if you will, of the WTO, its dispute settlement system, which, until the appellate body was in essence killed by the United States' refusal to appoint anyone, was considered highly strong. More cases than any other international court, if you will, than anyone else. And so that in and of itself created a tremendous imbalance. In the middle is the part of the WTO that I think is going to be critical. And that is the sort of both the secretariat, the committee work that's being done. Why? Because it is a place in which best practices get easily, readily communicated in this sort of go-between of the highly trained negotiators that are being sent to Geneva. And on the other hand, they're hearing, at a very basic level, okay, if you have an outbreak of aviation influenza, here is what the best experts in the world on SPS measures say you should do about it. So it is in that translating of agreements that may be reached at a higher level, at a regional level, at the WTO level, into the practicality. It is using the committee structure. It is using the highly talented secretariat to be that conduit between the high-level agreement and the bottom roots down there of how do we translate a trade agreement into what does it mean for what do I need to fill on a customs form? How do I get a seed to move from Kenya to Tanzania? How do I know whether there is an SPS measure, et cetera? It's in that piece of the WTO. And the second part of it is, it's one of the few places where I would say across the board around the world, there's still a lot of communication between countries that may otherwise start devolving into their blocks and never speaking to one another. I think that is the other part of it, is where everybody learns, to speak to each other, learns to understand and hear from each other where your differences lie. That is, to me, the place where we're going to have to think about a better reform of the WTO. Having said all of that, it's hard, because you are going to have to first get to a common understanding of what's the raison d'etre of the WTO. We're not there yet. But that's got to be part of the underlying equation.
Jennifer, and time flies when you're having fun. So I am fully aware that I've been dominating this discussion, and I am also aware that we're standing between you and the networking happy hour. So I would like to, though, end on one last final thought, because to me, obviously, the Center on Inclusive Trade and Development has a big emphasis on inclusive, but not only in its focus, the research focus as it relates to trade and development, but also in its approach. As Pamela said earlier, if you're aiming for an inclusive outcome, you have to start with an inclusive process. So maybe as my final question to you, Jennifer and Katrin, what types of partnerships are you looking for in this immediate while you're starting out and also in the future? And how can people get involved?
Thank you. And I know Jennifer will add to what I say too. Everything that we've talked about today depends upon partnerships, I think. And so this has to be central to what we do. This is a massive task that we've got before us, and we only stand a chance, I think, if we find ways to collaborate. So I just thought I would maybe mention some of the different types of partnerships that we envision and a few things that we already sort of have that we can kind of pull from. Jennifer mentioned already this, rich network of centers and institutes that we have here at Georgetown Law. We're so lucky that some of them came here today to celebrate with us. And hopefully that is where we start, is with some of these, some of these institutions that we have. Pamela, I hope we can work with you. I think that we are definitely, kindred spirits in how we're thinking about this with other international institutions as well. I do want to mention a couple of partnerships that I think that we are excited about already. One is a partnership that I've been working on with the United Nations. This started a couple of years ago. It actually came from a hackathon that I participated in with some students and recent graduates. I had never done a hackathon before, other than judging the one that IIEL does. It was great, really challenging and fun, and basically led to then the creation of a handbook on how to crisis-proof trade agreements. And so the first version of the handbook is out. We hear that it's being used by trade negotiators, which is incredibly exciting. We're working on another phase of the handbook with students and with recent graduates. And now the UN wants us to collaborate on setting up an online database of options for trade negotiators. And I think this goes to that awareness building and learning that I talked about before. And we really hope that this is a way that we can leverage some of our strengths here at Georgetown, including our focus on technology. So that's one thing that we're excited about. That's also related to another program that we have that is already running. So Jennifer and I both teach a class called the International Economic Law Practicum, and it's part of an organization called Trade Lab, which is this global network of law clinics that we are fortunate to be part of. And it connects students with real world projects, real world challenges, real experiences, and also connects us into this global network of other law schools. So I think that's a place too where we intend to really fully, deepen that work through Trade Lab, but also to deepen our partnerships with other universities in other parts of the world, with NGOs, with international organizations, as I mentioned, with foundations, with individuals, I think too. We're really excited. We have a new partnership with Visa, and it's so great to see you, Barbara. Thank you for coming. And we are really excited about this. Hope that this is going to be one of our first things out of the gate that we can do with the center focused on gender and some of the other things that we talked about today. And then I think I will hand it to Jennifer. I also hope that some of the work that I've done through my nonprofit work is something that we can pull into the center. So I think, and I guess last of all, the last thing that I will say before handing to Jennifer is it's our community. It's all of the students and the professors and the experts and the trade practitioners, everyone in the room and online, and hopefully, others we can engage through this. I think you're right. This can be a way of really bringing the conversation around some of these really exciting things that are happening in trade, the AFCFTA, which you mentioned, which is something I've worked on a lot. Some of these innovations that are happening in other parts of the world, bringing them to the fore so that this is no longer a side note, that it is central. And so I'll hand to Jennifer to add to what I said.
Well, I have very, very little to add other than I think Pamela said it really well. I mean, she was commenting that she's been here all week. And I think it's really clear that the policy community writ large is really struggling for how do we put some real meat on these bones of everybody saying we want a worker-centric trade program, everybody's saying that we need these shifts, but it is down to the now, how do we actually do that? And so the only ones I would add is I think we obviously are hopeful that we're going to be including, again, a lot of the rich resources that are here in Washington, D.C., meaning a lot of both government officials, but also the World Bank and the IMF. We've done a lot of extensive work in the past with those institutions, the other development banks that are here. And again, our thought is to really do a lot of that programming. We're hoping to start, an effort to bring in and around the time of the IMF World Bank meetings, again, a group of what we'll call our own G20, a set of academic institutions that would come in and have these conversations between what is going on in the academy, what's the research that's being done. We could be kind of a hub of a lot of that research in a way that we then translate it to the government, to the World Bank, to the IMF, as a way of being that bridge between what's happening on the academic side with what's happening in the hardcore policy side. So it's that kind of place where we see the center having something really unique and different to offer, in part because we are here and located at Georgetown Law and in the center of so much policy making.
Perfect ending. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Pamela. Thank you, Katrin. Thank you to all of you, and also to our virtual viewers for being here to launch this exciting new center with us. In the spirit of collaboration, I invite you to obviously stay and network, have some cake with us, and toast to the new center. So thank you so much, everyone.